Stippling capes to a display level takes a long time, but what if it didn't need to? By combining techniques, we can make stippling not as boring, way quicker, without compromising quality. So here's the core tones for the red cape. We have Arbuckle's Brown from scale 75, which is going to bring a warm purple, and it's quickly becoming a staple colour for most of my projects. Next we've got Burnt Red from AK, which is a much more opaque tone, which will give our base coat coverage rather than just tinting the surface of the black primer. To these colours I'm just going to be working up, adding in some Grimy Grey from AK. I'll create a rough blend on the wet palette, so I can just pick at it as we work up the blend. One optional step I'll be doing is creating a separate mix from just Burnt Red and Grimy Grey. This will give pure red highlight tone to modulate the plum red produced by the 50-50 mix. This is an optional stage, as I'll be reinforcing the red tone with Fleshed Hair as red anyway later on in the process, but this secondary mix just gives me a little bit more fine control for the distribution of colour. Off camera I've applied the base coat of the 50-50 mix. I've just given it 2 quick coats to get a nice opaque non-streaky finish. Now we can start with this stippled cape by not stippling. The big time saver is going to be sketching in our first 2 layers of highlight, or 2 to 3 layers of highlight with a large brush and standard layering. For this I'm using an arrow brush from Chimera, but any size 2 or 3 brush would work great for this stage. We are saving time by doing this, as we're covering the largest surface area and proportion of the blend. On top of this, these first highlight stages sit at the lowest value of our blend. So if we were to stipple all of this from the beginning, at the end of the process you wouldn't be able to see all of this work. It'll just be wasted effort unless we're trying to enter a competition, in my opinion. I'm applying the paint with a thin layer consistency, where I would need about 3 layers to get full coverage. I'm following the areas of light that fall naturally on the model. You can see the shine spots here on camera. If you need a reference point, just take a photo at the beginning of the process. Now, in order to make this cape feel soft, I'll be making one change to where I'm placing my paint compared to the reference photo. On all the folds, I'll be rounding off the sculpted detail, pushing brighter paint where perhaps in the reference photo it's showing a dark tone. I'm doing this not only as I want to soften these sharp details, because I'm painting cloth, not plastic. The reference photo at the end of the day is showing me the behaviour of a different material. So to make this look accurate, we need to look at some reference. Pick up on the patterns and behaviour of cloth. In my case, I'll be expanding the areas of light and reducing the contrast. This will make the form look soft and matte, and behave much more like cloth. The only caveat to this is that it's a Warhammer model, and this is a small one. It's on a 25mm base, so I'll need to give it a little bump in contrast, just to make things readable. This is something I wouldn't need to do on a larger model, say a 75mm or bust. When laying down these first, time-saving highlights, the brushstroke should follow the curvature of the model where it can be identified. There isn't many micro volumes, but when you look on your reference image you can pick out small islands that we can join up to the overall master volume of the cape. Thinking of it like a mesh on a 3D model or a topographical map, if we were to draw a grid on a flat piece of paper and then bend that surface to conform to the same curvature of the cape, those straight lines of the grid would no longer be straight, they would be describing the curvature and volumes. So following this train of thought, we can follow these curves and simulate and exaggerate the sculpted form, giving the cape even more depth. Now that we have our values sketched in with the big brush, it's time to start thinking about texture. So I'm swapping to a small size 1 Da Vinci brush here, and I'm just feathering out more highlights. But now I'm paying more attention to the texture I'm creating. I want to have more scratchy marks showing up, whereas before it's all about rendering the form building value, just sketching in those volumes. Now we're building up to the eventual stippling. And now that we're using this smaller Da Vinci brush, we can do what I was saying before about rounding off the form and really making this model look more like cloth than the painted plastic. Making sure the shadows have a nice fall off and everything is nice and soft. I'm doing this with short lines, scratchy lines to resemble maybe threading. It doesn't need to resemble anything, but the most important thing is that we're using texture rather than generic layering at this point. And before I start adding more texture and value, I'm going to make sure that I go back and just smooth out the low end of the blend. I'm not worrying about the mid-tone values I've done. It's more here on the cape where I've got a large area of dark shadow and I've just put in quite large marks that haven't been refined yet, and I'm not going to be adding too much information to that in the future, so I want to make sure I've got a good basis to start from when I do eventually stipple. So I'm taking glazes of the dark just above the base tone, which would be the arbuckles and burnt red. Just above that, I'm taking that, thinning it down quite a bit, and then just glazing into the light. And now when it comes to the actual stippling, I'll be using more or less the same mix for the first pass, and this is being played back in real time, so you can see the speed at which I'm placing down the dots. I'm being very deliberate about where I'm putting it. I don't want them to overlap. I want to have a definite space in between. If they both touch, if I get too close together that are touching, I'm not saying I need to repaint it, but I'm aiming to have a decent space in between each of the particles. This first pass isn't going to affect the value much, but it's going to establish like a base for our texture. And don't be worried about putting marks down too far into the shadows, as there's going to be plenty of glazing in the future stages to homogenize everything back. So if we need to knock down value, we'll do it with our dark transparent tones and not with our opaque midtones. This way we preserve our texture work. Now that I've shown you how I go about the stippling, I'm just going to speed it up here for the rest of the process. If you wanted to spend less time stippling, by all means you could continue with this sketchy style we were doing before for a couple more stages of the blend and leave the texture work, this controlled stippling, to the final, say, 2 layers of highlight. You would still have a strong presence in terms of the texture, but it would take even less time. I want mine to go for like a kind of mid-level display standard, so I'm going more or less half and half on sketching to stippling. And that half and half is based off of the value in the blend. The stippling is still going to take more or less 80%, 75% of the whole painting process, whole painting time. Here you can see this is probably the darkest I'll go for any of the stippling, because as I said in the intro, I don't see the point in stippling dark tones if it's just going to be pretty much invisible at the end of the process. So I would only stipple as low down as a mid-tone and then glaze it to the actual value I want it to be. And the more I work up in value, the more I'm going to gauge how much I need to soften and bring up the shadows on the sculpted form. You can see in areas right now in the folds they're still pretty dark, and as we go forward I'm going to be softening them out more, especially when we get to the next stage, or I'll start introducing some purple bounce lights to really soften out those shadows and give them more atmosphere and character to make it fit in with the Soulblight skeleton undead vibe. Here I'm starting to use that secondary tone, a secondary mix of just the pure burnt red with grimy grey, and I'm trying to use this only in the central column, the main focal area that I want for the model, because I'll be adding a lot more value to the edge of the cape, and he's got quite a wide cape. It brings the focus quite far away from the actual figure. So I'm using that red only in the central column, the closer it is to his body. That way it catches the eye better. Red is the most eye-catching colour. And the further out to the edge of the cape, I'm going to start introducing more purple greys. That way we have a nice composition for the cape. And when it comes to painting this more methodical display standard stippling, it's a test of patience. The more you put in, the better it'll look, but you do have to be quite disciplined that you don't start rushing your marks. I did it plenty of times on this painting process where I would just start putting too many marks down in too short a period of time, and they wouldn't have the right quality to them. They wouldn't be dots, they would sometimes be like really short lines. And if I don't catch myself quick enough, then that will really harm the overall quality of the texture. And again, it's not a problem if we have this maybe 1 or 2 times, but if it starts to really get inconsistent in terms of the stippling texture, it's going to start looking like we've got lumps all across the cape rather than it being just a nice thin bit of cotton. Doubling up your marks and making these mistakes, it's not a big deal, and this really only comes down to when you're trying to really push yourself, get the perfect result, and aim for competition quality. Now I'm going to start mixing up some purple bounce lights to fill out those shadows. To do that, I'm going to mixing together amethyst purple, bit of arbuckles and burnt red, along with some grimy grey and demonette hide. It will be looking quite dark on the palette compared to the rest of the red, but we need to keep in mind that we're putting this into the shadows, so it doesn't need to be that bright, and we do not want to overpower the primary light source for the red cape, which will be the sunlight. This is an ambient kind of fantasy, doesn't really have much of a practical reason to be there. It's just there for rule of cool, but we don't want to overpower the sun. And if you're unsure about whether it's too light or too dark, just put it on a small patch of the model and just see how it looks when it's dried. Don't worry about how it's looking when it's wet. It will appear more opaque and brighter when it's wet. Just wait until it's dry to see how it's really going to look. And when applying this, I'm applying it in the sketchy style, nice and thin, so it will soften out any of the texture work I've done, but I'm not too worried about that. I just want to get it in all of the shadows, applying more to the bottom of the cape, which is closest to the ground. And another thing which will help homogenize things as we're going, I'm going to be doing some very small, very thin washes and glazes of pure burnt red. You can see with all of the glazing and the kind of sketchy stippling that I've been doing, I feel my brush strokes are quite frantic and I didn't quite have the focus here. You can see I've been doing some really kind of rushed scratching, wear and tear to the edge of the cape. I was quite unhappy with this because I definitely rushed it too quick and I ended up repeating a lot of my marks. The quality of the damage that I did wasn't really that good, so I'll be coming back to that later. And I thought whilst I'm still in the same frame of mind, I was just doing continuous stippling, I would just continue doing work on the bulk of the cape, raising up the value and making the blends just a bit nicer. With that done, I'm switching to the smallest brush that I'm going to be using. This is a super small, I think it's a series 93 or 96 from Rose & Co. So I think it's a 000. And this is where I'm going to be working really slow, really methodical, and really focusing on getting single dots one at a time. And this will be only for the final jumps in value. I'm making sure to only apply it to the brightest spots. Once I've done that and I'm happy, I'll slowly start bridging out and dispersing more particles to make the transitions feel a bit more smooth. And now that we're using this really small brush, you'll find naturally that your blends will get much smoother and just better quality, because obviously we're using a much smaller brush, we'll be putting down a much smaller marks. And think of it in terms of like a resolution image. At the start of the process, we're using a big brush, these big marks, so it's kind of a smaller resolution image, and these tiny marks from this tiny brush really bring a lot more resolution and quality to the blend. Now that I've got this smallish brush, I also have the most control of where I'm putting these marks, so it's now that I'm going to be trying my best to sculpt with the paint. I really don't like these folds which tuck behind and come out from the back of the spear. They kind of just seem like they've just been added in. So here I'm going to be adding some quite bright paint to continue those folds around the back of the spear and kind of integrate them a bit better with the rest of the model. I'll never be able to get these perfect without sculpting on top of it, but it's going to help a great deal by faking some 3D detail. There's also going to be areas of the model that are too small and quite hard to reach, so in those cases I'm not going to risk stippling, because I know I'll probably just get paint where it doesn't need to be. So I'm just going to paint those areas, those really tight folds, with just normal brush strokes. Those areas are always going to be really small, so they won't necessarily detract from the overall quality of our texture work. Now we're starting to get quite high up in the blend. We're almost at the top of our value range, being very conservative with the dots. And then once I've looked at my reference photo and I can see where the brightest spots are, I'm starting there, and then I'm slowly bridging out, as I know I need to cover a larger surface area to make it not look like shiny plastic. And as it's a Warhammer model, I'm giving special attention to the edges. This isn't necessarily how a cloth cape would act. It wouldn't have really bright, well-defined edges, but that doesn't really matter, because if that's how it looks in reality and we just do that on the model, it's going to look boring. And when we take photos of it or look at it in person, the detail and where the form ends isn't going to be readable. It's just going to vanish into obscurity. So we need to define those edges, make it pop and jump out at us, so we can see clearly what's been sculpted, where the detail is, so we can actually read the model. But again, it's going to add a lot of interest and it's going to align well to the character. It all makes sense. I know I've been going on a lot about mark spacing, making sure your dots don't touch each other, and that's not the only way to stipple, that's not the correct way to stipple, but in relation to stippling a cape, I'm deliberately keeping my marks spaced apart because that defines the roughness of the material. So if the marks were much closer together, borderline touching, as a result, as you build up your blend, you're going to have much less value contrast because you don't have the previous layers showing through. So what this gives is an impression of a perfect, really soft surface, and therefore with that smaller value contrast, you have a much softer material. Now for this, as I've said, getting those details in makes it align with the character, well, so does a nice rough, really worn, almost threadbare cotton cloth fabric for the cape. So I'm keeping my marks deliberately quite spaced apart, because then we have all of the value from the previous layers showing through, and we have a much greater value contrast, and therefore it looks rougher. The surface looks more uneven and imperfect. This whole time I'm using quite similar paint consistency. The higher up in the blend I'm thinning it a bit more just to get some flow, but for the most part I'm using like a fairly thin layer consistency. But one interesting thing that I found out on painting the front side of this cape, I did make a mistake in where I overloaded my brush with too thin paint, and as a result I got quite a thick bead of paint that was quite thin, so I got some tea staining. Now for a different cape on a different character, say a Stormcast character who's quite pristine and shiny, doesn't have a lot of wear and tear across his armour and the rest of his elements on the model, that tea staining wouldn't fit. It would look like just a straight up mistake. And when I did it on this model on the front, I thought, oh, I'll bug it up there, I need to get rid of that. But as it dried and I looked at it, the more I liked it, it just fit in a lot. It looked like weathering, or like a burn or a bit of dirt build up on the cape. So you can really have a lot of fun with stippling. There's a lot, that's why I said it's quite versatile and flexible. You don't have to use the same paint consistency. You get the best results with like a thin layer consistency, but you can play around with thicker paint, thinner paint, and get loads of different results to the surface. And that's an important thing. If we look at stuff and we think it's a mistake, but the longer we look at it, we can kind of give it a bit of context. Or as long as it doesn't take ages to get context, then you can reliably imagine that somebody else would give it the same kind of context. So your mistakes are no longer mistakes. Now it's time for the Flesh Tearers Red Tonal Glaze. I'm thinning this down a lot, so for every one brush full of paint I'm adding about 3.5 brushfuls of water. We want this super thin so we can have the most control and apply it nice and evenly and thin. I'm using the same brush from before, the Da Vinci size 1. I'm loading up the brush, but then I'm getting rid of all of the excess on the paper towel, so when I do my swishing motion here, I'm applying a thin, even layer of paint with no pooling. You can see as I'm putting down the paint, well, it's wet, it looks quite opaque, like I've made a big jump in hue and saturation, but really once it's dried it's going to look a lot more homogeneous, like I haven't put anything there. So with this paint I'm going to apply 2 to 3, maybe in some areas closest to the body, and in the darkest shadows I'll apply 4 layers. And why am I glazing with a transparent tone? I said it previously before, but I'm going to explain it a bit better here. I'm using transparent paints as we are only affecting the tone, the chroma and the saturation. We retain the clarity of our mark making, our texture work that we spent so much time establishing. This tonal glaze will homogenize our values a touch, so in a sense our texture work is going to be less visible, but it's going to be much more visible and give a higher quality finish than if we were to glaze and blend with our opaque tones. Like if we were to glaze AK burnt red, deep red, or any red for that matter, instead of this Flesh Tearers red, those paints have additives in them to make them cover better. So they're not going to be designed to glaze perfectly like this Flesh Tearers red, which is basically an ink. We always run the risk, if we're using those AK or like just normal paints, we're running the risk of having muddy tones in the values, tide marks, stuff that will not make this blend as rich as it could be and seamless as it could be. So we're creating texture and value with our opaque tones and using transparent tones to richen our shadows and homogenize. After the Flesh Tearers red, I'm noticing certain areas of the cape that I think are a bit too bright and need more tone, so I'm just going to be using really watered down Arbuckle's brown in this case, kind of making more of a vignette around the edges of the cape to give it more curvature. It kind of strikes me as a bit flat at the moment, and the way it's sculpted is quite flat, but I wanted to give it more rounding off around the shoulders to give it a bit more shape and volume. Now, as I said before, I really rushed the edge wear before when I was in stipple mode, but now I've had the time to kind of really focus in, and I'm using, again, the really small brush. I'm taking my time, kind of changing my mindset from stipples into really small, detailed, thin lines and scratches. I'm working my way around the majority of the edges of the cape. That's the part of the cape that's going to be dragging on the floor, interacting with the environment the most. But also you got the holes in the cape. There's the holes there for a reason. They've been worn down and damaged. So I'm going to take my time here, going around all of the edges. I kind of fall into a pattern where I paint almost like spider webs. So I'm trying to break that muscle memory. And I don't want to do just a straight up edge highlight here. It needs to be broken edge highlights. There's no consistent lines. It's a strung together load of dots and scratches that make up the edge. And as I was putting this first pass down, I thought it looked quite nice. But then as it dried, I looked back at it and I was like, oh, I can't see any of the marks I just put down. So I've ended up doing about 2 or 3 passes of this to get the value just where I wanted it. I was being quite conservative, as I should. I didn't want to overdo it and then have to glaze down. So I built it up slowly with about 3 layers, each time covering a bit less of the area. And the good thing about this is I build up muscle memory where I put paint before, so I can kind of make it nice and detailed and have some pop. Because if I went straight to this highest value on the first pass, it wouldn't look as blended. I'm not blending, I'm just creating a gradient just the same way they would do in the Heavy Metal Studio with a chunky edge highlight, with the following 3 edge highlights to just cover a smaller and smaller area. It just gives the effect of a blend. And for these areas where I'm putting quite large blob highlights, I'm only doing that to the edges I know will be facing up. I don't want to put too much detail like on the holes. I don't want to put an edge highlight on that downward facing edge, because it kind of eliminates any volume information. It just makes it look quite flat and evenly lit. I want to have some drama to this piece. Whereas before, when I was doing this the first time, I was doubling up my marks. When I did a scratch, I would notice that I would do another scratch exactly the same right next to it. And that's when you start creating patterns and it doesn't look natural. So I was trying to treat each brushstroke as an individual to try and get the most random and realistic kind of weathering pattern to this cape. And the main reason why I'm adding this, as I've already said, is it fits the character, but ultimately a stippled cape which is just stippling runs the risk of being quite boring. So adding this in, we're giving more interest. It's not just a stipple cape, it's a stipple cape with weathering. And one last stage to finish off the cape, I'm just glazing some really, really thin amethyst purple over all that weathering, just to kind of round out the colour transition. We've gone from the pinky reds all the way down to purple now, and it's kind of a nice solid hue transition. Now that's done, I just wanted to show you some comparisons to previous works, which are all stippled capes, but they look drastically different. This was my really old Golden Demon entry. This entire cape was stippled, but this is what I mean when you put your marks too close together, the blend kind of looks muddy, almost like you've attempted to blend this cape traditionally with layers and glazes, but you just haven't done it well. It just looks muddy and unrefined. But when we compare it to this one that I did in more or less a quarter of the time compared to that Golden Demon entry, we've got the individual marks, there's space in between, it looks deliberate, and it has a much better effect of reading as cloth. And it doesn't look like a mistake. And then compare it to this other Soulblight I did again recently. I wouldn't even say this is stippled. I didn't intentionally put stipples. I was more doing layers and glazing and focusing on the scratches. And because this cape isn't the main focus of the model compared to this Soulblight, I didn't need to put as much effort in. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video on stippling. If you want to see more about more Soulblight stuff, we're going to have a nice in-depth tutorial series for the newly released Soulblight models. I'll be painting up the Soulblight Lord on horse, and Liam will be painting up the new massive Soulblight dragon. Cheers, and check out the Patreon if you're interested for any tuition. And as I said, more in-depth videos just like this. Thank you. Bye-bye.